This morning, we're going to be in a passage in Matthew chapter 17. For those of you who have Bibles, or if you use your phone for that, you can go ahead and get a head start. Matthew chapter 17, starting at verse 24. But before we go there, how many of you have ever taken a personality test before? Raise your hand. All right, a lot of people in the room. And maybe you did it for school or college, or maybe it was actually a part of a job interview. They wanted to know your personality or how you were wired, or maybe how you were going to fit in that specific culture. And I'm one of those people that I think personality tests are helpful, but I'm also not going to build my entire life around it, all right? I know some people like that. You're like, okay, take it easy, all right? Your whole life is not in this tiny little box of a personality test, but nevertheless, they are helpful in understanding the way that we are wired, and not only the way that we're wired, specifically how that wiring or how that personality can influence the way our relationships go, right? The relationship dynamics that we have in our lives. Now, one of the more popular personality tests that has been around for quite a long time is called the Myers-Briggs personality type. And if you've ever done that test before, you know there's different categories, and one of the categories is trying to decide whether or not you're a thinker or a feeler. Now, if you're like me, you don't like the sound of that. You're like, I like to think that I both think and have feelings at the same time, right? That I have a head and a heart, but that's not at all what it's saying. It's actually addressing the primary mode in which you make your decisions. And so it's actually defined for those who are thinkers. They prioritize logic, analysis, and objective truths. How many of you would say you are in the thinker category? That's how you make decisions. Now, the feeler, on the other hand, they value and prioritize relationships, harmony, and individual needs. And I got to be honest, I fall into the thinking category, and I don't really like it because it sounds like I don't prioritize relationships or the way that other people feel. And sometimes, if you were to ask my wife, she would probably tell you that is how it feels. One of the things that I've realized years ago, actually early on in our marriage, that I was a thinker, my wife was a feeler, and there's something else that I found as a result of that feelers don't find constructive criticism all that constructive. Right? Some of you are like, yes, I know, I'm there, or I'm married to one. But the reality is our personalities, the way that we're wired, has a massive influence in the way that we deal with one another, the way we deal with conflict, the way that we communicate, right? The ways that shape our relationships. Another thing that affects it is our family upbringing. Some of you grew up in houses that I would call conflict prone. The way that you dealt with all of your issues was yelling. How many of you grew up in a house like that? Right, where there was just always yelling going on. My kids right now are like in a season of this, specifically my two older sons with their younger sister. They are just constantly fighting, like nonstop. It never ends. Right? It's just conflict all the time. Some of you, that was your dynamic in your home growing up. Right, your parents, maybe they were always hashing things out in front of everyone in public, like up front and ugly all the time. Some of you were shaped by that, shaped by those dynamics, and maybe you tend to be more argumentative, and you find yourself in verbal altercations because that shaped you, and your personality shapes the way that you interact in those ways. Others of you grew up in homes that were conflict averse. These were the homes that didn't like to talk about emotions, didn't like to talk about problems because they were always afraid someone was going to be offended, and things always got swept under the rug. How many of you grew up in a house like that? We just don't talk about those things. We don't want to address them, and so they just are left unspoken. All of these things, these shape the way that we interact, communicate, and deal with conflict. Even today, in a larger part in our society, I think we're living in a unique time in that we live in a highly offended culture. How many of you know someone who is always offended about something? If they happen to be sitting next to you, do not turn and glare at them right now. If you happen to be married to them, especially don't do that. Right, we live in a culture that is incredibly offended at all kinds of things. In fact, I think if you're the ages of 25 or younger, you've just been shaped by that reality. Those of us born 90s, 80s, and later probably are less likely to be offended by many of the things that others find offensive today. Now, I share all these things because, as I've been saying, it affects the way that we engage with the world around us. It affects the way that we deal with our relationships and the people closest to us, and even, again, dealing with conflict. But the major question, apart from how are we wired in our personality and our family upbringing and how has all of that shaped us, as good as it is to know about those things, the major question that we really need to be looking at this morning as we're here gathered together as the church is, how does Jesus model the ideal for us as his followers? When we're talking about communication, when we're talking about conflict, when we're talking about dealing with offense, how does Jesus model this? Because on one end, I do not think as Christians we are called to be people who are always walking on eggshells, right? Trying to not offend anyone and afraid of our values, afraid of convictions to where we're always worried about stepping on people's toes. On that side of things, we can fall into the people-pleasing trap. Where we really don't have an identity in and of ourselves, but we kind of just shape-shift to our environment or to the people that we're around. But on the flip side, and I think even oftentimes this is more prevalent, sometimes in the church, we also don't want to be the types of Christians that are belligerent or confrontational or controversial for the sake of being controversial. We've all seen those people, especially on social media, those who claim the name of Christ, and yet they're always in some sort of controversy, some sort of conflict, always the loudest person in the room, right? Spouting off their opinions and their convictions. And I think both of these, in many ways, really miss the heart of what Jesus wants us to be and how he wants us to operate. Because Jesus models something different. Jesus models both spiritual conviction and compassionate consideration. Jesus models both spiritual conviction and compassionate consideration. And for our topic today, I want to really examine the latter, compassionate consideration. What does it look like to be thoughtful in our engagement with others? What does it look like to consider others in our interactions, in the way that we speak, in the way that we even deal with conflict or controversy? And so I want to read the passage that we're looking at this morning in Matthew chapter 17, starting at verse 24. And I'll be honest, this is somewhat of an obscure passage. It's only found in Matthew's gospel, but yet I think there are some significant truths that can actually be gleaned from this and what Jesus says and what Jesus does in this passage. So let's read that. Starting at verse 24. When they, that is, the disciples and Jesus, came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon?" Which is another name for Peter. "From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he, Peter, said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." So what is the context of what's happening in this scene in the Gospel of Matthew? Jesus and his disciples, they go to Capernaum, which is what some would call the home base for their ministry operations. And when they go back into Capernaum, they've been traveling, doing ministry all around. Jesus has been teaching. He's been healing people. He's been releasing people from oppression, from demons, doing all these incredible things. And now they come back into Capernaum. And at some point in time, whether immediately after or shortly after, we don't know, there's a tax collector that actually asks Peter specifically about Jesus' position on this tax. Now, what is this tax? And I got to find this humorous. They were asking questions about taxes 2,000 years ago, so not much has changed. I've seen that recently with Fairfield County property taxes. There's been a bit of a stir and a buzz about that, but they were still questioning things even 2,000 years ago. But interestingly enough, this is not a Roman tax like we often hear about when we're referring to tax collectors. This is actually a Jewish tax. This is a tax called a temple tax that was taken from all Jewish men 20 years old or older. And the reason they were taxed every single year was for the upkeep of the temple. The temple was central to the Jewish faith, right? The temple represented the dwelling of God amongst his people in Jerusalem. And so they collected this yearly tax every year. It was about 2 days worth of wages. And so if you think about what you make every year, if you divided that up, whatever those 2 days would be, that's what they were paying in this tax every single year for the upkeep of the temple. Now, what's interesting is this individual does not ask Jesus. So we don't know. I'm actually a believer. I think Jesus was already gone. And so at some point in time, the tax collector talks to Peter, but he asks Peter not about Peter's position. He asks Peter about Jesus's position on the tax. And so he asks him, does he pay the tax? Does Jesus pay this tax? Now, the question is why? Why is it a concern about Jesus? I think there's a couple reasons. Jesus at this time was fairly well known. He had gained a reputation because of his teaching, because of his miracles, but also I think because Jesus at times was controversial. Right? Some of the things that Jesus did, some of the things that Jesus taught was controversial in the eyes of the other religious leaders. So part of me wonders if they were just curious if this was another area where Jesus was going to be different, if this was another area where Jesus was going to be controversial in his perspective. The other part of this is in the first century, formally trained rabbis, which were Jewish teachers, actually were exempt from this tax. So they didn't have to pay the temple tax. And while Jesus was considered a rabbi, at least by his disciples and those who followed him, he was not considered a formally trained rabbi. And so there might have been some question as to whether or not Jesus saw himself as a rabbi and whether or not he was willing to pay the tax. But what I find humorous is when Peter comes into the house, Jesus is aware of the conversation. And this is one of those snapshots where you see the omniscience of Jesus. Like he's aware of the conversation even though it looks like he wasn't actually present. And so before Peter can say anything, when Peter walks into the house, Jesus addresses the conversation that Peter's had. But he doesn't bring up the conversation directly. He actually asks Peter this question in a parable form. He says, who do the kings of the earth take their tolls and their taxes from? Do they take it from their sons? Right? Do they take taxes from those that are members of the royal family? Or do they take taxes from everyone else? And Peter, though he's not well educated, right? He's a simple fisherman. He's smart enough to know the answer. Right? It's that kings, they don't tax their own family members. They don't tax their own sons. They tax everybody else. And so Peter tells this to Jesus, of course, answering correctly. And what Jesus reveals here is something significant. He is making a point about himself. He's actually saying that in the same way that the children or the sons of the king don't pay tax, he, as the Son of God, he's claiming divinity here. He's actually saying that he's exempt from the temple tax. I mean, this is a massive thing that would be easy to really gloss over in the text. Right? Jesus is equating himself with God, with the family of God, claiming to be the Son of God. He's saying in the same way that sons of earthly kings don't pay tax, I also am exempt from this tax. Why? Because the temple existed for who? For God. And so Jesus was saying, in a roundabout way, he was saying, the temple belongs to me. I don't have to pay the tax. But that's not where Jesus stops. And I think the significance of him revealing his identity actually only adds to the significance of what he says after. I mean, for Jesus to say that he is the Son of the King, Son of God, the one who doesn't have to pay the tax, and then what he says after signifies a deep level of humility that we should take note of and that we should follow as an example. Because this is what he says in verse 27. However, that's the key word there. However, I don't have to pay the tax, right? I am exempt because the temple belongs to me. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. How many of you wish that you had a way to pay your taxes like that? I want to point out the significance of what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is saying, I'm not required to pay the tax. However, I'm concerned about how they would view that. I'm concerned about how they would respond. I'm concerned about the perception they would have of me. I'm concerned about unnecessarily offending them. And so this is incredible because in many other places, Jesus was not afraid of being offensive. Right? He offended the religious leaders all the time by some of the things that he said and taught and his perspective on things that radically differed from theirs. Here's the difference though. Jesus was not walking around intentionally trying to offend people. Jesus was not walking around intentionally trying to be controversial. Instead, we see an example here where Jesus actually tries to avoid it when it was possible. Jesus says, however, not to give offense to them. I'm not trying to cause a problem. I'm not trying to cause offense. I'm not trying to upset them. I'm not trying to cause greater turbulence for my mission and for the furthering of the kingdom of God. I'm not trying to cause unnecessary problems. And so Jesus was concerned how they would respond, how this would affect them if he chose not to pay the tax, even though he was exempt. And here's the first thing I want us to see from this. It's a simple but important truth as Christians. We should care how our words and behaviors impact others. We should care how our words and behaviors impact others, right? This is the heart of love. Right? Jesus called us to love God and love people. We could summarize all of the commandments in those two things. To love God and to love people. If we are to love people, it means to seek their well-being, to seek their highest good. But if we're disregarding the impact of our behavior, if we no longer care how our words or how our actions affect other people, can we really say that we are loving them? Can we love people well without being intentional in the way that we interact and being mindful of how the way that we interact with others and how we speak and how we deal with conflict and how we deal with disagreements? Can we really love people well if we don't care how it affects them? See, the truth is, to love people well, we have to care. And more importantly than that, I would actually say, if we are representing Jesus, we should care how people perceive him in us. We should care, if we are going to bear the name Christian, how people perceive Christians in the world. The Lord knows we've done so much damage, the church, in culture where people view Christians in some sort of distorted ways because of our lack of concern how we interact with others. The Apostle Paul, he put it this way in a letter to the Philippian church. He said, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." Paul is contrasting what is natural and what is normal to us, which is to be worried about ourselves, to be worried about our wants, to be worried about our needs, to be worried about our preferences, to be worried about our opinions, and to not always be concerned about other people. And Paul is arguing for something that is radically different. He's saying, don't just be concerned about yourself, be concerned about those around you. Be concerned about how your life and your actions and your words and your behaviors impact the people around you that you're interacting with each and every day. Be concerned with them. And in humility, actually count them as more significant than yourself. And he flips the script of what is natural to what I would call supernatural or spiritual, what we can only do with God's help, to be mindful of those around us. And I didn't have time to put it in here, but he gives this profound theological basis why. If you look up this passage in Philippians chapter 2, I would encourage you to read it later on. He goes on to say, because this is the example that we have in Christ. And he talks about how Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. In other words, he didn't claim his divinity, he didn't claim his royalty, but he emptied himself and he came into the world and he took the humble posture of one of his creatures, a human being, and then he subjected himself to evil people, and then he died on the cross for the sins of the world. And so Paul is arguing you should have this mindset because this is the mindset that Jesus had when he came into this world. And as his followers, we're called to follow his example. And so we should care about others because Jesus cared about us first. 1 John puts it this way, we love because he first loved us. Because of the concern that Jesus had towards us, we should have concern for others. And when you think about Jesus, right, Jesus didn't have to do any of this. Jesus didn't have to empty himself. Jesus didn't have to come into our world. Jesus didn't have to subject himself to suffering, and yet he did it for you and for me, on your behalf and on my behalf. Elsewhere, Paul gives additional considerations on how we should think about our daily lives and the way that we interact. And in this case, he specifically talks about the unbelievers, those who are outsiders, he calls them. And he doesn't do that in any sort of derogatory way. He actually talks about them in the sense of we should be mindful of those that we interact with that don't know Christ. We should be all the more purpose in our behavior and in our words. Why? Because we're bearing witness to Jesus to those who don't know him. He says this in his letter to the Colossians. Walk in wisdom towards outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious. Can we just pause there for a moment? Let your speech always be gracious. Not sometimes, not when it's convenient. That's a tall order. I don't know about you, but for me it is. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. What is Paul talking about here? He's talking about being intentional. When he says walk in wisdom, he's saying instead of acting foolish or being flippant in your speech and in your words and in your actions and in your behavior and in your attitudes, be intentional, be purposeful. Don't live accidentally. Realize every single day there are people that are watching you. Realize every single day that your behavior and your words and your actions have an impact on the people around you. And so be careful. Be aware. I love that he says making the best use of the time. You know what he's saying to me when I read that? He's saying see every interaction as an opportunity. Make the best use of the time. We know that we have a short time on this earth, and one of our callings as followers of Jesus is to make an impact for the kingdom of God. And you and I have interactions with people every single day, every single week, not just our family members, but our co-workers, our neighbors, people that we rub shoulders with, the parents that have kids that play on the sports team that our kids play on, all of those people that every single day, every single week that we interact with. Paul says, make the best use of the time. See it as an opportunity to be a positive influence in the name of Christ. Be purposeful. And then he says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt. In other words, let your words be life-giving. Don't let your words be a stumbling block to Christ. Be intentional in the way that you live. What he's saying is we should consider others because it can point them to or away from Christ. We should consider others because it can point them to or away from Christ. That is a powerful truth when you stop and you think about it. That your life has the power to influence a person to either point them to Jesus or to point them away from Jesus, depending on how you live, how you behave, and how you act. That there is great power in the influence that God has given to us. And I want to be blunt and completely honest here for a second. People are not simply always offended because of your faith in Jesus. Sometimes people are just offended because you're being a jerk. Can we be honest? See, we live in a day and age right now where everything is an attack on Christianity, or at least that's how we perceive it. And I'm not here to say that that's not true in some sense. We know that the powers of this world from a spiritual way of looking at it are absolutely antagonistic towards Christianity. So we shouldn't be shocked by that reality. But sometimes it's not because you are following Jesus, it's just because you're being rude. It's because you're being offensive. It's because you're not being thoughtful. It's because you're not being considerate. And we have to be mindful of that reality rather than living under this guise that, well, they just don't like me because of my faith. That's not always the case. I've told people this for years. I'm convinced that the reason that people reject Christianity is either because it's a misunderstanding of Christianity or it's a caricature of Christianity. It's because they don't understand the heart behind what Christianity really teaches. And a part of that is because of the way that we conduct ourselves. And so we have to be mindful in the same way that Jesus in this scenario was mindful about how his actions would be perceived. And so Jesus responds in light of this concern. It's not just that he cares about the tax collector being offended. He responds in light of that reality. And here's the second thing that I want us to know. We should take a posture of humility and sacrifice so we can better love others. This is what Jesus does, right? He's fully planning to pay the tax even though Jesus doesn't owe the tax. Jesus is ready to pay the tax, though he doesn't owe it. And there are times in life where we should be willing to do things that we maybe don't have to do or are not obligated to do for the sake of loving other people. And there are other times in life where we should choose not to do things that maybe we feel like we have the rights or the freedoms to do for the sake of loving people. Both of these are exemplified not only in the life of Jesus, but even in the teachings of Jesus. In the Sermon on the Mount, which was an incredible sermon that Jesus himself gave about kingdom living. In other words, what does it look like for the people of God to live in the world? And one of the things that he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 41, he says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. How many of us have heard the expression, go the extra mile? Maybe you didn't know that was from the Bible. That was from Jesus. Right? It's the idea of going above and beyond, because in the first century, Roman soldiers could actually take a civilian and legally they could make that civilian carry their gear for up to 1 mile. How'd you like to do that, right? Like a federal or state worker just comes up to you and you have to run errands for them for a certain amount of time. That's what they were dealing with. And what Jesus says here was completely radical. It actually would have blown their minds for them to hear it. He says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, actually go with them 2 miles. Go beyond what is expected of you. Go beyond your simple obligation. Why? Because that will make an impact. They will see something different and distinct about who you are, and ultimately about who you serve. They will see God in you. And so the idea was, I don't have to take another step, but I'm going to do so for your sake. What if we lived our lives in that way, where we went beyond simple obligation of what was expected from us, or just doing the bare minimum and actually going above and beyond that when God gives us opportunities, knowing that it can impact the lives of other people and that we can bear witness to who Christ is. The Apostle Paul talks about the flip side of it, not doing things that might affect other people, things that even though in the eyes of God may not be sinful, at the same time we should be wise in whether or not we choose to do them because of how it affects others. In the book of Romans, and actually he talks about this in Corinthians as well, so this was going on in multiple places. One of the issues that was happening is there were Christians that were eating meat that had been sacrificed to pagan idols. So if you imagine like going to the grocery store, like imagine going to the meat aisle knowing that the meat in the meat aisle had been sacrificed to pagan gods in their worship services. Like that's a crazy thought. And there were Christians that were eating this meat, and this is what Paul actually says to them. He says, for if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. Do you know what Paul's theological stance on this was? The meat that had been sacrificed to idols, you know what he says? He basically says, it's fine, it's just meat. Like at the end of the day, we know that you serve the one true God. Eating meat, this isn't going to defile you. This isn't going to spiritually affect you. But what he says going beyond that is something different. He said the meat isn't the problem. The problem is if you eat it among other Christians who are affected by that or offended by that, then you shouldn't do it. Because you should be concerned with how it affects them. In other words, you shouldn't do things that hurt other people, even if you have the right to do them. Or put another way, you can be right and still be wrong when doing what you want hurts others. See, one of the difficulties I think we have as Americans is we so often talk about our rights and our freedoms and our liberties. And I'm grateful that we have those, but oftentimes we only think about those things in selfish terms when the call of Christ is actually to go beyond that and not just simply do what we're obligated to do or always take advantage of our liberties, but at some times there are moments where in humility and in a posture of sacrifice where we don't do things because we know how it'll affect other people. And there are a lot of different topics that could pertain to this. Alcohol is one of them. Some Christians are people who think that drinking alcohol is wrong. Other Christians are completely fine with drinking alcohol, but the question is how are you conducting yourself? We know the Bible, I'm not going to get into the whole topic. The Bible clearly labels drunkenness a sin, and it gives us cautionary words of wisdom about how we use alcohol, but there are examples of this where we should be concerned of how another person perceives this. If I'm drinking alcohol with a person that's offended or drinking alcohol next to a person who maybe struggles with alcoholism or addiction, that's something that I should stop doing for their sake, even though it might be fully okay for me to do it. I think about political stuff. This one gets people riled up. But what if we stopped the constant posting of political things because we were actually concerned about how other people perceived us because of our faith in Jesus? That matters more than becoming a stumbling block for someone that has views that are different than our own. Because it's easy to say, well, I believe this is the truth. I believe this is what is right. And yet the question is, do we care about how it impacts other people? Do we care how it impacts our witness? Years ago, I have a funny story that will illustrate this. When I was 17 years old, I was a junior in high school. Actually, I would have been 16 at the time. I went on spring break down to Florida. I had some family members that lived in Sarasota, and the cousins that I had grown up with, they actually were living in another state, and they flew in, and we all came together for this spring break, and it was a great time at my aunt and uncle's house. My grandparents were there, and one night we got this idea we were going to go to the beach, and my grandparents did not like that. My grandma always worried about all that stuff, and we kind of just were like, whatever, we're going to go. And so we piled together in this car, and like good teenagers, we thought it would be a good idea to stop at a gas station and get some high-quality cigars. I say that sarcastically for those that weren't picking up on that. I had two cousins that were a couple years older than me, and so of course they were able to drive and were legally able to buy these cigars. But then I had my younger brother with me, and they had a younger brother that was younger than my younger brother, and we were all together. And we went to the beach, and we lit up our Black and Milds, thinking that we were so cool in doing so, hanging out on the beach. And like 10, 15 minutes into it, we're just hanging out there, thinking we were so cool. And we noticed that my younger cousin was just like off by himself. And he was digging this hole in the sand. And we're like, what is this? What is he doing? And so we go over there, and he's got tears streaming down his face. He's frustrated because the people that he looked up to most in the world are now smoking tobacco, and it devastated him. Like he was crushed by that. His brothers, his cousin were doing something that his whole life he was taught this is something you shouldn't do. And now we laugh about it. We say, hey, Caleb, remember that time you were digging the hole to China on the beach? But I think about that. That's a humorous example, but about how our actions influenced him and impacted him. It devastated him, right? He looked up to his brothers. He looked up to his older cousin. And we had let him down in that moment. What if we lived in such a way where we didn't want that to happen with people? We didn't want to let people down. We didn't want to offend people unnecessarily because we cared about them. We cared about the way that we lived. Paul, elsewhere in Romans 2 chapters earlier, he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And I want to emphasize the depends on you. What he's saying is we should be willing to do whatever we can to remove conflict in our relationships. We should be willing to do whatever we can to remove the barriers in our interactions with other people. See, the truth is we can't always stop offense. Sometimes people are just offended. Sometimes people get mad about little things that we're not even in control of. But the emphasis here is saying live peaceably with all when it's up to you, when it depends on your interactions and it depends on the things that you say and the things that you do. It matters how you live, how you act, how you treat others. It matters. And so there's even questions that we should consider. Is what I'm about to do or what I'm about to say, is it necessary? Is it helpful? Here's one, is it the right time? Sometimes it's not the right time. Here's a big one for me. Is it the right tone? You guys know about that in marriage. Is it the right tone? Are they a person who's willing to hear and receive it? There's people in my life that I won't talk to about certain things because I just know they can't handle it. Like that they're not there. They're not able to have a civil conversation. Is it a fact or is it simply my opinion? These are things that we should be considering in our interactions with others, in the words that we speak and the things that we do. And again, it doesn't mean that we're always going to be able to remove offense. It simply means that we're intentional with the things that we're doing, that we care enough about people that we're being purposed in our interactions and in our words and in all that we do. Jesus cared enough to be willing to pay the tax. And I love this random obscure verse at the end and how he pays the tax. And I almost wonder if there is not humor involved here because Peter was a fisherman. And so he tells Peter, right, to go and basically go and cast a hook, go fishing, and the first fish that you catch is going to have a coin in it, and you're going to be able to pay the tax for me and for you. And so Jesus supernaturally enables him and Peter to do what he believed was right for the sake of honoring those who were collecting the tax. And there's something that I want to point out here. While doing so, Jesus provides for what Peter owed, but also what Peter needed. And the last thing that I want to point out is that when we seek to honor God, he supplies all that we need to bless us and others. When we seek to honor God, he supplies all that we need to bless us and bless others. When our mindset is in alignment with what we've been talking about this morning, when we care about other people, when we care about blessing people, when we care about showing Christ to others, when we're just not living flippantly or selfishly, and when we have a desire to honor God in our relationships, I simply believe God blesses that. God gives us what we need. See, Jesus has supernatural power and provision, and he shares his inexhaustible resources with his people. Not just finances, though in this case that's what it was. And I love that because he takes care of us and he blesses us and our needs, but also so that we can be a blessing to others, but in all kinds of ways. God provides what we need. God's generosity towards us has always been so that we can enjoy it, but it's also been so that we can steward it to be a blessing to others. In the Old Testament, as many of you know, if you've been here, if you've grown up in the church, God created the nation of Israel for the sake of being a blessing to the world. In other words, for the sake of the world seeing God through his people. And when he originally called Abraham, I want you to note this. This is what God says to him. He says in Genesis 12, I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Notice he didn't just stop and say, Abraham, I'm going to bless you. He said, I'm going to bless you, but that in blessing you, you would be a blessing to other people. That would overflow to the world. Paul says something similar to the Corinthian church who were rich in their generosity to the saints in Jerusalem who were poor and in need. And in their giving, this is what Paul says to them. He says, he, talking about God, who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way to be generous in every way, which through us will provide or produce thanksgiving to God. Paul was saying, as you seek to faithfully honor God in your generosity, in your concern for others, in your desire to love others well, God is going to continue to provide for you. Not just for you, but so that you can be a blessing to others. So that God will give you what you need to make a difference in the world around you. See, God gives us what we need to do his work, and he blesses those who are trustworthy stewards. Those who have a heart and a mind to honor him by seeking to actually love people in tangible ways, who are living intentionally. And God does this so that others would see him through it. Did you notice that Paul said that? That it will produce thanksgiving to God. In other words, their generosity was giving God glory. That people would see God through their actions, through their generosity. And the same is true for you and for me. That when we seek to live in such a way, that God will bless that and use it. You know, a couple months ago, there was just a season of life where I wanted to give to a couple different things. And as I was looking at our finances, things are tight. And many of us know that, especially in these last few years of inflation. And I remember like thinking about it in this tension of I want to be able to give to a couple of these things outside of generosity and tithing and all of that. And I just remembered wrestling with it and wondering, like, is that a reckless thing to do? Are we in a place financially to be able to do that? And in that same season, there was a person that out of the blue came and blessed our family in a totally unexpected way. And I remember thinking in the moment, like, what a moment of gratitude it was, but I also remembered thinking in that moment, this was so that I could be generous. It wasn't just for me. It's not for myself, it's so that I can be generous. And I want you to consider for a moment, apart from just money and finances and your job, but all that God has given to you, what if it's not just for you, but what if it's for the sake of others? What if it's the relationships you have at work? What if it's your position? What if it's the level of influence that God has given to you, the platform he's given to you? What if it's the people that you live next to that he's given healthy relationships with? Look, what if you took inventory of your life and you realized that God has not simply just blessed you with many things that we should be grateful for, but also things that should be stewarded to honor him and to be a blessing to others? My question as we close this morning is how would it change our relationships if we truly follow the example of Jesus? I want you to make this intensely personal, to think about your marriage, to think about the most difficult maybe relationships that you have in your life, your friendships or your coworkers, how people perceive you on social media. How would it change things in our relationships if we truly follow the example of Jesus, one of humility and sacrifice, one that considers the well-being of others and not just our own desires or preferences? How might God desire to bless our lives in a way that would greater impact those around us if we had the desire to do that? My last question is, where are the areas where we have not shown Jesus to those around us? Maybe it's in our words, our actions, our preferences, our opinions. Maybe it is the things that we post on social media. Where are the areas of our lives that have not been in alignment with the heart of God? What are the things that we could tweak or change to better reflect Christ in us and through us? Would you bow your heads? And as we just go to God, I want us to think in terms of what I mentioned earlier, to be people of spiritual conviction, but also compassionate consideration. But there are certain truths, values, things that we know are important to us as followers of Jesus. But have we deeply considered how those manifest in the way that we interact with others? Have we valued truth over love, or have we been able to hold those two together? Walking both in truth and in love. Walking both in a posture of spiritual conviction, but also being compassionately considerate of those around us and how we can demonstrate Christ to them. God, we thank you that we are in this journey of faith where you are molding us, shaping us, and transforming us. God, that we don't have to do this by our own strength, and we never could, but that you give us your Holy Spirit to convict us, to encourage us, to lead us, and to guide us. And we pray, as uncomfortable as it might be at times to receive correction, God, we ask that you would show us the areas of our lives where we've not represented you well. Because God, our desire is to honor you. We want the world to see who you are in and through our lives. And the truth is, all of us have failed to do that well. And there are specific areas in our lives where we need to take inventory. There's things that we need to change. God, would you give us the courage and the strength to do that? Would you point out those things in our lives so that we can better represent you? so that in our words and in our actions, in our attitudes and in our behaviors, in our interactions with others and in the way that we deal with conflict, all of those things, despite our family upbringing, despite our natural personality, despite what the world says, God, we desire to do things your way. And we know that that can only happen through the power of your Spirit. And so, Lord, help us. Help us to honor you and help us to love others the way that you love others. Help us to see people the way that you see people. Help us to model a posture of humility and sacrifice, just as you did for us. God, we love you. We thank you for who you are. We thank you for all that you've done. And we ask all these things in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.